think so.
Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here. This is our fourth and final seminar for candidates for the director of the Lake Erie Center. We have Dr. Craig Stow here today. This afternoon, he's coming to us from Ann Arbor. He's been in Ann Arbor for about 12 years, 11 years at the NOAA's Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory. Prior to that, he was at University of South Carolina, and then at Duke for a while. He got his undergrad at Cornell, and then he moved to Louisiana, and then PhD at Duke. He did some teaching at Duke along the way, and then he did as well as a postdoc at University of Wisconsin. He's got a long list of publications, over 120 publications. Most of his work, as I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about today, has been on water quality issues ranging from PCBs to phosphorus to hypoxia and statistical methods about how to deal with some of these problems. So with that, I'll let you talk about your past and your future.
All right, I appreciate it. Actually, John just gave the first part of my talk, so we can skip through that part a little bit. I appreciate the opportunity to come here and make a presentation. It's not the first time I've given a presentation but it's been a few years and it's good to be back. I also want to thank John and the search committee. I've chaired search committees and been on search committees, and they're actually a fair amount of fun, but a real amount of time and energy, and so thanks very much for all of the efforts. I'll start off, actually. That worked. Okay, the other forward button. Yeah, I'm good. Thanks. So my talk is going to look something like this. This is not a research talk. It's a bit of an introduction to things I've been involved in and how they might pertain to things that go on here at the Lake Erie Center. I'm going to offer a brief self-introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work I've done recently in Lake Erie or related to Lake Erie, and then I want to see if I can bring that to a discussion about the Lake Erie Center and things that do go on or could go on here. And as I was thinking about putting this together, I realized, well, there's a certain risk level associated with each of these parts. Self-introduction, I felt a self-introduction was appropriate because most folks here don't know me at all. I've a few longtime colleagues in the room, but I thought this would be useful and realize that you talk about yourself too long and people go, yeah, boy, that guy sure does like to talk about himself. So I gave that a risk level of about 2. I'm going to say some things about Lake Erie, and this is really pretty much my involvement in the activities under the new Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. I know I'm in a room of Lake Erie experts, but I'm not going to talk about those sorts of things that people here know a lot about. So I gave this a risk level of only 1 check mark. And then I want to say a few things about the Lake Erie Center. And this is really where I get onto thin ice, because my suspicion is I am the person in the room that knows the absolute least about the Lake Erie Center, although I've learned a lot over the course of the morning. So consider my remarks about things here and things that could happen here as my attempt to start a good discussion so that we can begin to move things forward. I'm surprised at how many times I've had this question this morning. I'm actually originally from upstate New York, do I need to be in proximity to a microphone for the go-to webinar? Is it? Okay. Okay. So, not the Great Lakes watershed, probably the Chesapeake Bay watershed, this general area. But then I did a bachelor's degree at Cornell University, which gave me a toehold in the Great Lakes watershed, I guess. I took classes, a lot of classes in the aquatic sciences. I took limnology and oceanography, which was a bit of a stretch for upstate New York, and those sort of things. And then I graduated, and there weren't placement services or anything in those days. So I came home for a year. And I thought, like, what do I do? I guess we call that a gap year now. Yeah. That makes it sound overly profound, like I was doing a lot of deep thinking about my future and my place in the universe. Actually, I got a job at Red Lobster, which was where I began my career in the aquatic sciences. And one night, after I finished washing the dishes, I went to the night manager and held up one of our lobsters and said, our menu says this is a Maine lobster. Maine lobsters don't look like this. They have the asymmetric claws and stuff. And then I got a job at a lumberyard where I drove a forklift for the remainder of the year. But by the end of that year at home, I sort of got things together, and I went on for a master's degree at Louisiana State University. It was a master's degree in marine sciences, although my work was all actually on a lake, that particular lake, Lac des Alans. And that's where I began working on issues related to nutrient cycling and sediment interactions and that sort of thing. And actually, while I was a graduate student there, one day a delivery truck showed up and none of the guys in the Sea Grant shop were there. And the call went out, can anybody operate a forklift? And so I was there. When I finished my master's degree, I got a job working for the state. I was in the DEQ or DNR, one of those predecessor agencies. And my job was writing wastewater discharge permits, NPDES permits, for major industrial discharges. So I traveled all over the state. Given my background in industrial processes, I became the expert in petroleum refineries. But I traveled all over the state working on those sorts of issues and writing wastewater discharge permits. And in the course of that, I was assigned a facility that was over here just south of Lake Charles that had a permit that allowed them to discharge up to 25,000 pounds of ammonia per day into the Calcasieu River. And this was an existing permit. That seemed a lot to me. And just below their effluent canal, I mean, this was literally a canal. You could take a boat up. The dissolved oxygen in the Calcasieu River hovered in the range of 1 milligram per liter. And this was at the surface. It wasn't, deep down. So I became very concerned about that particular facility. And as I pursued it, one of the things I learned was that the reason they had such a high effluent limit was because they had commissioned a water quality modeling study with a private consulting firm. And that study had indicated that if all of the point source discharges were pulled out, the highest the dissolved oxygen would ever get in that stretch of river was 3.6 milligrams per liter. And this seemed amazing to me. And there was no reason to pull them out because the actual numerical criterion was 4. It was going to never meet the criterion, so why should they remove their ammonia? This was my introduction to water quality modeling, and it struck me as really incredible that you could predict 3.6. It might have been 3.60. This was a really complex system. There were a lot of discharges. This was a tidal system. There was a lot going on. And so I became pretty skeptical, but it also planted the seed that quantitative analyses drive decision making. And if you want to be influential in environmental decision making, it was good to have a facility with quantitative analyses and modeling. So that's what made me eventually go up to Duke University for a PhD in modeling, where my emphasis was on uncertainty analysis and estimating model uncertainty, predictive uncertainty, and how good were those forecasts. Uncertainty is an important consideration if you're making decisions based on a model, and that was my emphasis there. From there, when I finished the degree, I went up to the University of Wisconsin, the Center for Limnology. I was a postdoctoral researcher there for several years, and that's where I looked at issues related to contaminants in the fisheries. I think John mentioned the PCBs and the fishes. But that was my introduction to Great Lakes work, because I was looking principally at the dynamics that were going on in Lake Michigan with respect to how the contaminant levels were changing and how that might affect fish consumption advisories and that sort of thing. I then returned to Duke University as a visiting professor. My advisor had taken a reduced appointment to become head of the State Water Resources Institute. So I came back in a visiting position as a contract professor to teach his classes and to do advising. But I also did quite a bit of research at that time, again looking at nutrient interactions. But at this point it was nitrogen primarily, because we were in the coastal area and my focus was on changes that were occurring in the Neuse River estuary. And at the time that was a really hot national situation. There were allegations of toxic dinoflagellates and that sort of thing. And so I was fairly involved in that discussion, did quite a bit of research, and did a lot of the work that led to the eventual development of a TMDL for that system. I was briefly an associate professor at the University of South Carolina. I wasn't there very long when I got a call from the director of the Great Lakes Lab here. Said, we've got a position, would you be interested? And I'd liked working in the Great Lakes, so we talked about it. I liked the cooler environment, or at least I thought it was going to be cooler. I grew up in the Northeast and thought, well, it's a climate I'm more comfortable with. So that's when I came to the NOAA Great Lakes Laboratory. That was about 11 years ago now. Since I've been there, I've been involved in a number of different things. Most of them have dealt with nutrient interactions. We had a 5-year project up here in Saginaw Bay looking at nutrient inputs and estimating nutrient loading and phytoplankton responses and that sort of things. We developed some probabilistic models to estimate different effects under changes in nutrient inputs. And more recently, I've been involved in activities related to the 2012 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. As most of you know, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement's gone through several iterations. There was a call for a renegotiation that came about partly as a result of things we were seeing in Lake Erie, the renewed algal blooms that were going on. So there was a fairly extended process that resulted in the new agreement in 2012. And I was asked to be on, there are 10 annexes in the new Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Annex 4 deals with nutrient issues, and I was asked if I would serve on the Annex 4 subcommittee. Each annex has a subcommittee that is supposed to carry out the things that are called for in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So Annex 4 is the nutrient subcommittee. Within the annex, there are 6 lake ecosystem objectives. Some apply specifically to Lake Erie, like minimize the extent of a hypoxic zone resulting from excessive phosphorus loading, that sort of thing. It called for updating substance objectives, in other words, target nutrient concentrations, 10 milligrams per liter, that sort of thing for phosphorus. And it called for updating the phosphorus load targets. Now, the original load targets were set in the 1977 amendments to the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and they've been in place ever since then. And even though Lake Erie was meeting those targets most of the time, suddenly we were seeing the algal blooms again. So this committee was supposed to revisit those loads and see if we needed to develop new loads to meet the problems that we were now facing in Lake Erie. And it said, do this for Lake Erie within 3 years. And that was, even though this is the 2012 agreement, I guess it wasn't ratified officially until early 2013, something like that. So this subcommittee met for the first time in late 2013. We meet regularly, we have regular phone calls, and one of the things that we did do, and we did this on time, was to devise some new target phosphorus loads. And those were proposed in, 2015 and became effective in 2016. And this is if you're really interested in all of the details, this is the document that describes how we arrived at those loads, or those targets. Now, I put this in here because I know in a presentation there's nothing people want to see more than a slide of a whole bunch of small text. But actually I put it in because this is hot off the press. To add some legitimacy to the whole process of establishing the new target loads, the EPA convened a science advisory board. It was chaired by Bill Schlesinger, some of you probably know who he is, to review the modeling we had done and all of the things the supporting work we had done to develop those loads. I don't know how well you can see it, but this is an excerpt from the SAB, the Science Advisory Board's final report last week. It was dated June 6, 2017. And there's a couple salient points here. The first sentence or two talks about the SAB strongly endorses development of an adaptive management program to implement and evaluate nutrient reduction goals. And this is one of the bullet points from the executive summary. And the last sentence says something to the effect of, we've identified a number of different things that need additional research, and you should pursue those things. And this was something we recommended in the report, actually, was in the 1980s, following the development of the original target loads in the 1970s, we didn't know what was going to happen. And so it was a big experiment, whether we called it that or not. But by the early 1980s, it was clear things were getting better. And there were a couple of different manuscripts published that said, we established target loads, we're close to meeting the loads, things are good. And then we said, we're done. It was sort of a premature declaration of mission accomplished. And we did other things. So as we approached the development of these new loads, we were very explicitly aware that if there wasn't the right kind of follow-up, we'd be back in the same position we were by the 1990s when we had apparent success and things changed, and for reasons we didn't fully understand, we're having problems again. So we deferred, we knew there were things we didn't know the answer to. We deferred a lot of those to adaptive management. And this now report that's official from their science advisory board is in a sense a mandate that says, do this and do it well. And here's a bunch of things you should consider. So this is hot off the press. This is a little bit of a backdrop for things that we might think about moving forward with the center. I'll just say a couple words about adaptive management. Unfortunately, it's become a buzz phrase where everybody says, oh yeah, we're going to do adaptive management, whatever that means. It's actually a very well-established concept with an extensive literature and numerous books behind it. The first paper I could identify was actually a paper from the early 1970s by Buzz Holland and some other colleagues. So it's been around a while. And it arises because of the explicit recognition that when we make environmental management decisions, we don't know what's going to happen exactly. We have different things to guide us. We have lab experiments. We have numerical models. But what happens in the real system is always a bit of an experiment. At least in principle, you could reduce the uncertainty in this decision via ecosystem scale experiments. Those are hard to do. So you have to recognize that your management action is an experiment and learn from that management action. It means really having some testable hypotheses and devising research and observation to follow up on those hypotheses. And then to update management actions with that knowledge that you have, because things aren't going to happen exactly like you think they are. The thing that I've left off here is a formal adaptive management process also has an active stakeholder engagement process where the folks that have some stake in the outcome are brought in and kept updated and their input is solicited. So that's another important piece. But the important point here is that this is supposed to be an active learning process, not just a trial and error. Well, our management actions didn't work out quite like we thought, so we better try something else. That's not the point. That's what we've done by default, and that's not the best way to move forward. Just a couple things in particular. This is a depiction of nutrient loads into Lake Erie over time. And the point I want to make here, this is a depiction of the size or intensity of the algal bloom. And this figure, though you probably can't make it out real well from the back, is just intended to indicate that some years we've had pretty much the same nutrient load, but we've had very different sized algal blooms. Sometimes this is a matter of timing or various things, but we don't really understand why. There's a testable hypothesis, and there's something that folks at the center could be thinking about, for instance. And of course, the other thing that's come up now is the issue of nitrogen. In some respects, we thought the nitrogen issue in freshwaters was long ago resolved, but it's now become a big issue again. And it's unclear what the role of nitrogen is in toxin production in particular, but possibly also in the speciation or the community structure that's out there. And it's probably different in different places across the western basin of Lake Erie. Lake Erie isn't one big homogeneous system. So specifically what's going on with respect to nitrogen is an interesting issue. Actually, in the Maumee, total nitrogen's gone down over the last 10 or 15 years. Is that contributing to blooms in a funny sort of way we haven't thought about? I don't know. But if we think about it hard, we can investigate those things and learn a lot. We're going to be doing a really big experiment out there if all goes well. And the other thing I thought I'd toss in here is that we've got these fixed target loads. Load is flow times concentration. And the paper we published a couple of years ago indicates that this is a smooth long-term trend of precipitation over this region and Maumee River discharge. They look oddly alike. But if we have a fixed target load, and river flow or discharge is increasing, at some point we could exceed that load regularly, even though the actions in the watershed have been pretty effective. We need to think hard about what effect that's going to have. It's also going to change the way the lake responds to phosphorus inputs. If the flow is increasing, the nutrient transport's further out, depends on the timing and a lot of things. We haven't come to grips with that. But we've got a great experiment forming up out there if we adequately think about how we're going to monitor it and what other specific experimentation might go on. So these are just a couple things, but I think they present some opportunities research-wise as well as outreach-wise for the Lake Erie Center. So I looked a little bit, I looked a lot on the web for for some sense of what the Lake Erie Center was about. There's a clear mission statement. I guess it's what 5 bullets, and it seems to have a couple different components. The first two really talk about research. The first one is researching the lake, and it seems to me you're doing a lot of that. The second one is broader research, really talking about, I guess, the land-water interface and economics and sustainability and various things. That's pretty broad. I don't know how you think about accomplishing that effectively, given current staffing resources. The third one is dealing with facilities, and the fourth one is university-level research for students, and the last one is outreach. Essentially a couple different components. Lake research, broader research, facilities, student research, and outreach. But I couldn't find a strategic plan anywhere. Does such a thing exist for the center?
You didn't look hard enough.
Where should I what?
We can't tell you that.
Okay. My sense was there might not be one. Aha. So I think this is an important priority. You know, there are 5 parts to the mission. Some are ongoing, some could be ongoing. Some you've got to think hard about, well, you know, how much economics are we going to do? I don't know, but that's a discussion to be had. And I guess in the background, the point isn't to have a strategic plan. This is like Dwight D. Eisenhower quote, plans are nothing, planning is everything. The real value is sitting down as a group in subgroups and saying, what do we want to do and how do we get there? Having the plan is great. The reality is once you have a plan, unless a candidate for a position is looking for it on the web, nobody's ever going to look at it again. But going through the process is a very, very valuable exercise. And it seems, my guess is that would be a good exercise for the center. So breaking these down a little bit, the first one I said, this is in lake research. Again, it seems to me you're certainly doing a lot of that. There are probably some other opportunities. With respect to the second one, some things that the center should think about are convening workshops on specific Lake Erie issues, bringing in outside expertise. You can only talk about these things so much with the in-house expertise. Thinking about making this place a little bit of a retreat for faculty from the main campus. Thinking about ways to make this maybe a sabbatical destination for folks from other places. You know, bring in experts from the West Coast. It needs, you know, you have to think about whether you can house somebody like that, what their needs might be. But they could conceivably teach short courses, interact with students, that sort of thing. State-of-the-art research facility. I saw a bit of a chicken and egg sort of thing here. It's almost like that's maybe the last thing you should consider. You've got a facility. This is a really good facility. It strikes me as being somewhat underused, but there's a short and a long term in thinking about how you use it and fill it up and staff it up in the short run. And some of these things are short-term goals, but then there's the long run. If we had funding, what would we add to the facility? What kinds of opportunities could we possibly not house because there are limitations with the facility the way it is now? on cutting-edge environmental research for essentially graduate and undergraduate students. Lots of possibilities here, and I know you do some of them. It's a question of whether they're done to the degree possible and figuring out what the limitations are. Various short courses would be good. Directed short-term research for undergraduates that bring them out here might be a good idea. Alumni presentations. Do you ever invite recent alumni back and say, what are you doing now? Those are real good. That helps the students, the current students, say, this is what people are doing, and gets them excited. And engage secondary school students, teachers, public, and everybody else out there. Well, how do you do that? And again, I know you do some of those things at this point. Public presentations on Lake Erie issues. This should be a center where people think to come for somebody who's going to speak on particular fishery issues, or maybe just generally on the opportunities for walleye fishing, or specific issues regarding toxin production or those sorts of things. I know some of that goes on. That's a really good activity to engage with the public. Teacher workshops and short courses, and of course through this course of discussions this morning, I've learned a lot of that does go on to some degree at some times, of course funding specific. You've got to figure out a way to make those things work and pay for themselves. My crystal ball on funding and resources isn't exceptionally good, and I think everybody knows the current political climate and where some things stand in the president's budget. You know, I can't any better than anybody else give an indication of how those things will play out. Well, I guess the best indication I can give is they won't play out exactly as they were proposed in the 2018 budget. GLRI is slated for elimination, Sea Grant is slated for elimination. It's probably not going to happen like that, but we have to be thinking broadly about how we're going to support all of the activities that go on here under a variety of different budget scenarios. I've heard Chris Winslow with Ohio Sea Grant talk a few times now about initiatives that they have undergone with the state for funding various things. This place needs to be actively involved in those kinds of discussions. There's a real need to think about all different possibilities, state level, federal level, different kinds of institutions or private sector things. But the first thing is to develop some goals and a strategic plan that says here are our priorities. Next, how are we going to make those happen? One of the things I thought about was an NIHS Center grant. This is a big endeavor. I was involved briefly when I was at South Carolina. We were thinking about a center grant. These are, I think, typically 5-year, multi-million-dollar grants with the possibility, possibility for renewal. Those sort of things are certainly feasible. We've got clear environmental health problems here and a whole lot of related things, possible research as well as outreach, and it supports all of those things. But it is a big endeavor. They hold workshops on how to prepare a grant package or a proposal package for those sorts of grants. I attended one at one point in Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. Certainly feasible. You've got all the issues here. Recognize the amount of work up front. And this is where partnerships are really, really necessary. This is probably a multi-university sort of thing, and it's going to be really imperative to recognize that moving into the future, particularly in the face of uncertain funding, these partnerships are going to be essential. And they're good on their own merit as well. Even if funding was pretty much guaranteed, there's a lot of local expertise, and it's going to be really important to recognize that and work with the folks in the basin on complementary sorts of issues because you learn a lot doing that. And that, I think, is all I had to say. But hopefully this will initiate some good discussions. Thank you.
So, Craig, I have some administrative experience and ask for things. I'm asking for resources, and quite often I'm told no. How do you respond to a response like that? So how basically, what is your response and what would you do? Try to get some resources for the LEC.
You're going to have to, I mean, it has to occur at all different levels, at the university level, state level. And you want to know why they said no. I mean, no might be definitive and final. Sometimes it's a matter of persistence. This is a process, not something that just happens and you're done with it. And it's also a matter of being careful what you ask for. And that's where the faculty and associated folks have to sit down and say, what are our really high priorities? How do we justify them? But you have to recognize that it's not always going to pan out. And you have to have a lot of things going in parallel to best ensure success. But I expect the person who accepts this position is going to hear no a lot. And that's just part of the territory.
Yes.
Feeling like this again.
So your first slide about your danger zone on the Lake Erie Center mission page with your red checks, you brought up an obvious area that we're missing is the strategic plan. Have you been involved in strategic planning process with Goral or?
Yeah, I've been involved. And actually the reason I put the Eisenhower slide in there is my specific impression is we developed a strategic plan because administratively we were supposed to have a strategic plan, not because we engaged in a lot of constructive discussion about what we really wanted to do. And when the strategic plan was done, that was a check mark. That's, in my opinion, not really why you do this.
So you're a senior scientist. How much sort of administrative experience have you had sort of directing activities with other people or managing budgets?
Yeah, I've managed a couple large multi-million-dollar grants. I'm managing one currently. I've managed programs before within the school that I was in. It's limited, maybe. I don't know how else to characterize it. It's I have not managed a facility as diverse and large as this. Chris?
You mentioned partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming that means at different levels,
Sure.
so inside and outside. Have you thought at all about how those like strategies for developing those partnerships in a formal way? I mean, we all have partnerships with agencies that we work with on an individual basis. But for a center, how would you think about going about formalizing some of those or creating a structure where those partnerships are more lasting than individual grants?
In my experience, an awful lot comes down to having rapport with particular individuals and sort of fostering that kind of interaction. It's an investment that pays off in varying levels at varying times, but having networking and having individuals that are in various decision-making capacities is a really important part of that. Whether or not there have to be specific institutional arrangements, MOUs and that sort of thing, that comes down to the specifics. But it's mostly a matter of making your expertise well known and fostering the kinds of interactions that will lead to, I guess, synergy is a buzzword as well. I sort of hate to throw it out there, but you're really looking for that sort of thing. You're looking for folks at some of the area universities or institutions that have common interests, and you arrange to meet with them and you say, look, here's some things we could do together where we could produce something greater than perhaps what we could do individually. Sure. George?
It's hard for me to ask this without it being a softball question or comment, but when you're putting this, my impression from my remote perspective, this place needs a strategic plan bad. Okay. Now, in terms of creating a strategic plan, who comes to the table? You know, because I see there are plenty of people on main campus that really could utilize the center and could be brought in. I think there are people, you know, you mentioned partnerships. There are you know, statewide entities. There are people at nearby institutions that would certainly help out. How do you put that together so that it's not too big yet representative, and then presenting the plan and implementing? You know, so the strategic plan is a really easy thing to say, and it's an absolutely essential thing. Getting down to the details of actually who's at the table is
Before you answer, to piggyback on that, we do have a strategic plan, but nobody in the room knows about it because we haven't done that.
Is it in a wall?
I think so. We had a 5 and a 10-year strategic plan that were probably done 15 years ago, but nobody knows about it because we didn't do what you just suggested. We made a plan to make a plan, but nothing happened with it. So it exists, but,
Okay, all right.
but it isn't evolved.
Well, then you don't have to do that, I guess.
Nobody knows what it says. I mean, I think I have a copy of it, but we didn't do that second piece of following up on it.
Yeah, I don't have an absolute answer to that. There are clearly some core people, the faculty and closely associated faculty. Then there are perhaps folks a little more peripheral who you'd ask for input at some level, but not bring in the immediate discussions. And then perhaps there's another group that would review it more broadly. I don't know if the university might have some guidelines or protocols that have to be followed for that sort of thing either. So all of those have to be considered. How that goes exactly is something I can speculate on, but not exactly say in a definitive sort of way. Eva?
I know you said that your management experience on this level has been somewhat limited, but could you speak a little bit more about your management style and your management philosophy?
Yeah, people have to feel important. You want to let them be heard. You want to the extent possible, there are decisions that have to be made, and when they affect other people, to the extent possible, you've got to bring people in and get some feedback from them. It's not always going to be that neat and tidy. Sometimes decisions just have to be made. Sometimes they have to be made really quickly, and you don't have time for consultation. But if they're important decisions, you need to round people up and say, look, here's what's going on. And it should come in before the decision has to be made. You know, it's not often that something's going to come up where you've got to decide tomorrow about really important things that are going to affect people in a profound sort of way. There should be discussion that precedes it, so you have a good sense of where the people that will be affected stand on certain issues. But it sort of comes down to respecting the folks that you work with, and there are going to be problem people periodically, and you have to deal with those as they come up. But mostly you want people to feel important and that their opinion is respected and welcomed.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Craig? Great, thank you very much, everybody.
All right, thank you.
Please provide us with feedback. If you're interested in talking about candidates, I will be, along with hopefully a few other of the committee will be here
Shut
tomorrow.
down the webinar here. Did anybody actually tune in?
And otherwise on
I don't
campus.
know. And they may have already.
Oops, sorry. Thank you all.
Guys.
Oh, come on. Oh, that's fine.